我这边正常吗？那个分享屏幕，你们在那个聊天框里回复一下。对对对，等一下，这个题目写过来的好奇怪哦。等一下，对呀，为什么这样？应该等一下，我先分享一下题目。我刚刚那个分享屏幕好像有点不太对劲，就是变成那个左右切换的模式，不知道为啥。对，对。现在正常吗？现在都正常对吧？对，好，那现在开始。OK，各位朋友，大家晚上好，欢迎各位参加由 Mentrico 导师学院和组织隐形技能管理全球智库联合主办的大师系列讲座50场。今天是第20场，由来自美国的 Johel Brown-Grant 博士主讲。他给我们带来的主题是运用叙事策略将隐性知识转化为关键知识。首先，让我们来认识一下今晚的演讲嘉宾 Johel 博士。Johel 博士呢，他是美国邮政总局的曾经的知识管理专家，他也曾经是哥伦比亚大学新闻学院的助理院长。他自己呢创办了一家公司叫 StoryDNX， 其实看这个名字也能大概猜到跟故事是相关的。这家公司是专注于知识管理、设计思维和叙事策略的咨询公司。那自然他是一位叙事策略师，也是一位设计思维专家，旨在帮助组织利用叙事的力量，应用合理的设计思维原则，然后给组织带来独特的知识体验。那他非常善于开发知识和设计资源，然后给企业学习、组织变革和商业、科技、高等教育以及政府部门的战略沟通提供支持。那最近呢，他出了一本书，叫做《知识管理和讲故事实践》。讲故事实践这个也是我们今天晚上话题的核心，是讲组织如何通过叙事策略将隐性知识转化为关键知识，然后来成功的实施隐性知识的传承。好，今天的讲座由 Mentrico 导师学院和组织隐性技能管理全球智库联合主办。Mentrico 是一家总部位于比利时布鲁塞尔的全球化导师服务咨询公司，业务遍及6大洲35个国家和地区。我们提供的导师技术课程、服务流程标准以及服务团队都获得了欧洲导师与教练协会的专业认证。Mentrico 中国是一家注册在上海的中欧合资企业。我们是在2019年的11月首次把欧洲导师技术正式引入中国。组织隐性技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 是注册在比利时布鲁塞尔的非营利性国际智库。然后这个智库呢，旨在推动组织隐性技能管理在全社会的应用，推动人类的高效率学习。好，接下来就有请我们今晚的演讲嘉宾 Johel 博士。Okay, now let's warmly welcome Dr. Johel Brown-Grant.
Hello, I'm Dr. Johel Brown-Grant, principal and founder of StoryDNX, a consulting company focusing on knowledge management, design thinking, and storytelling. I want to thank the Global Organizational Tacit Knowledge Management Group for their invitation to this webinar and for the opportunity to share what I have learned throughout my years of research into how narratives and stories can be used by organizations to share knowledge across groups, across themes, and how knowledge can be used to enhance the capabilities, the knowledge capabilities of an organization. For this presentation, we will focus on a few elements that you see in the agenda on the screen. The first one will be what is tacit knowledge? What is critical knowledge? We will then move on to briefly discussing the difference between tacit knowledge and critical knowledge. Then we will focus on how tacit knowledge can support the implementation, the discovery, the use of critical knowledge. Next, we will focus on what are the processes that come into play when we want to transform tacit knowledge into critical knowledge. And then to conclude, we will provide a few examples of narrative strategies that an organization can use to transform tacit knowledge into critical knowledge. I really want to thank again, like I said, the Global Organizational Tacit Knowledge Management Group for this opportunity. And let's get started. So I want to begin by asking the question, what is critical knowledge? So critical knowledge is the knowledge that is essential to the operational efficiency of any organization. And I'm focusing on this question because in the field of knowledge management, we always talk about how knowledge, the sharing of knowledge is important. But not all knowledge in an organization is critical. There is knowledge that is critical and there is knowledge that is not necessarily critical, but may still be important. My conversation today is about critical knowledge. The knowledge that, as I said before, is essential for the operational efficiency of an organization. And I want to explore that a little bit more by looking at 4 pillars that to expand a little bit on that definition. When we talk about the knowledge that is essential to operational efficiency, we're talking about 4 aspects. One of them is, how urgent is that knowledge? Is it knowledge that without it, processes may not be completed? In that case, we're talking about urgent knowledge that is essential, as I said before, for a process to be completed. So when we think about how urgent the knowledge is, there is a correlation between that and how critical the knowledge is. How relevant the knowledge is. Is it important enough for a project, or is the information contained in that critical knowledge necessary for a process to happen, for a strategy to unfold, for a project to be implemented? Meaning then, the relevance of that knowledge, if the relevance is directly related to the actual implementation or the actual the carrying out of a series of tasks, if the information pertains to that, then we're talking about critical knowledge, meaning that the knowledge is relevant and it's urgent for the task or the project or the process to be carried out. 2 more aspects that are important to understanding the concept of critical knowledge is importance. How important is the knowledge for a process to unfold? If it's knowledge that you don't necessarily need immediately, if it's knowledge that can be put off for later, if it's knowledge that will not affect how processes occur, how they unfold, then that low importance would not be correlated with critical knowledge. So critical knowledge, in addition to being essential, is the knowledge of highest importance. A high degree of importance is also correlated with how critical the knowledge is. And finally, critical knowledge is also associated with authority, meaning that the knowledge that is designated as critical is the knowledge that is designated as such by people in authority within an organization. Meaning that if we're talking about technical processes, those who have developed or put together a technical process will be able to define what knowledge is critical for that process or for that technical process or for that procedure to be able to be completed. So when we talk about critical knowledge, I just want us to keep in mind that not only is it knowledge that is essential, but it's knowledge that is relevant, it's urgent, if it's of high importance, and it's a knowledge that is based on an authority or based on authority within an organization. So now that we have a better sense of what critical knowledge is, let's briefly touch on the difference between tacit knowledge and critical knowledge. And I'm sure that we all know the difference, but just to emphasize it, I want to say that tacit knowledge is, as we know, that the knowledge that is in our heads is the hidden knowledge, the knowledge that we as people in knowledge management try to capture so that we can translate that and turn it into explicit knowledge. But within an organization, as members of an organization, we all carry tacit knowledge with us, but not all tacit knowledge is critical knowledge. However, critical knowledge can be based on tacit knowledge. So the purpose of this conversation then is to think about how we can use narratives and stories to capture that tacit knowledge in a way that it can impact critical knowledge. That's why we're in this conversation today, and that's what we want to be able to flesh out and understand as we move forward. So now that we understand the difference between tacit knowledge and critical knowledge, let's talk about how tacit knowledge can support critical knowledge. They're related, but they're not necessarily the same. Tacit knowledge and critical knowledge, as I said, they're related, but not necessarily the same. So when we think about how tacit knowledge can support critical knowledge, I want us to keep in mind that there are many ways that that can happen, but I want to highlight 4 major approaches or major ways in which tacit knowledge can support critical knowledge. The first is tacit knowledge can support critical knowledge in that tacit knowledge can transform critical knowledge. Let's think of an example. If an organization has a series of procedures related to onboarding in terms of how onboarding is to be carried out in an organization, how new members enter into an organization, how new members use a particular set of tools within an organization. If there are members who have used these tools or have gone through these onboarding processes and have discovered better, more efficient ways to get that onboarding process to be more productive, more efficient, much faster, that information if that information is brought to the organization, those faster ways, those more efficient ways can transform the ways that the organization is currently using. So tacit knowledge, and then tacit knowledge can also transform existing knowledge. Knowledge that we might not consider critical can also be transformed into critical knowledge. For example, if there is a new tool that comes into place, a new technology that is introduced into an organization, or a new process that comes into an organization, those with experience on that new process will transform and change existing knowledge. For example, let's think about the transition between typewriters and computers. When folks were using typewriters, those who were using computers had to transfer when the explicit knowledge along with the experiential tacit knowledge of the users came into place, transformed how people moved and changed from using typewriters to computers. So what I want to say is that tacit knowledge can transform the knowledge that exists within an organization, that knowledge that we have in our heads. If it impacts how urgent or how relevant the information that exists is, there occurs a transformation or a change. And the change is also important in that sometimes there might be information that we have within an organization that, because of changes in technology or changes in industry or within the market, that information may become obsolete, or it may be may not be relevant anymore. So those who have tacit knowledge about how these processes have changed, or the new trends, or experience using processes that reflect new trends, they can bring that tacit knowledge to repair, to fix, to change, to transform existing knowledge. And finally, that process of repair or change based on what we know in our heads, that process could also mean that the knowledge that is changed, that is critical, that critical knowledge that is changed or that is transformed, can also be enhanced. In some cases, when there is tacit knowledge that comes into play, as I said, it can transform or change or even repair existing knowledge or critical knowledge. But one thing that is important, there might be critical knowledge that exists out there that an organization is using, but individuals, because of their experience and their tacit knowledge, they can enhance, improve, expand that critical knowledge. In other words, they can bring new information that will add greater levels of importance to the knowledge that exists, to that critical knowledge. They can make it even more urgent. they can make it more impactful. So that's why I wanted to keep to briefly touch on how tacit knowledge can support critical knowledge, can influence, can have agency over the critical knowledge that exists in an organization. So now that we have that in mind, I want to, before I move to the next slide, to just put a question out there for us to think about. In the organizations where we work, let's think about how we capture tacit knowledge, how we capture the experiences of our fellow coworkers, how we capture those experiences and use those to impact critical knowledge. And maybe the first question should be, do we actually capture critical knowledge? Do we actually capture tacit knowledge to impact critical knowledge? The other thing that is important is, another important question to keep in mind is, do we have formal processes to identify and describe critical knowledge? Do we all know what are examples of critical knowledge in an organization? If you think about it, in many organizations where critical knowledge is important, there might not be an outright articulation of what critical knowledge is, or a description of the critical knowledge of an organization. So when we think about how we use tacit knowledge to impact critical knowledge in an organization, one question to ask maybe before that is, what is the critical knowledge of our organization? What are the processes that we use to discover it? And what are the processes that we use to describe it? Some organizations have the critical knowledge laid out in SOPs, standard operating procedures. Some have them in manuals. And even if they exist in those formats, in manuals and standard operating procedures and instructions, is that knowledge easy to find? Because if the knowledge is not easy to find, if that standard operating procedure is hidden somewhere, then that's not critical knowledge, because it's not available to those who need it when they need it. Remember, we talked about relevance, we talked about urgency. So critical knowledge then is a thing that or is a concept that I want us to think about in terms of what is our relationship within our organization with critical knowledge. So now that we have that in mind, let's think about what are the things that that can be done in an organization to transform critical knowledge, or transform tacit knowledge into critical knowledge. So I want to take a minute to talk about the processes that support knowledge transformation. And let me explain by that what I mean. Since we talked about what we can do, or what we could do, I should say, to capture tacit knowledge and transform it into critical knowledge, I want to review some of the strategies that are available to us to support that knowledge transformation. So as you see on the screen, one of the things that we have to think about when we talk about knowledge transformation is first think about having a clear understanding of how knowledge flows in our organizations. Having a knowledge audit. Many companies with standing knowledge management teams have gone through processes of knowledge audits. So if there is a knowledge audit in an organization, any documentation or any PowerPoint presentation summarizing either the knowledge flow or the knowledge or the results of a knowledge audit, that's one place where to start, because we have to, before we think about critical knowledge in terms of how we can take that knowledge and enhance it by bringing tacit knowledge to bear, we have to understand what is the state of knowledge management in the organization. This goes back to the question that I mentioned previously, where I said, what are the processes that our organization has in place to define and determine critical knowledge? How is that knowledge articulated and expressed? How is that critical knowledge articulated? Where it is stored? How we can get access to it? The first process to support that transformation of knowledge from tacit knowledge to critical knowledge is to first know what is the state of knowledge in the organization. Then the next process that can support knowledge transformation, remember we're talking about how we can use narratives and storytelling to capture critical knowledge, is to also do a narrative audit. And this I talk about, I've done narrative audits for organizations that I've worked with my company. A narrative audit is basically an audit that allows the organization to understand how stories are captured, how stories are shared within the organization. What are the stories? Who tells the stories in the organization? What are the stories about? What are the themes across those stories? because we live in organizations filled with stories, we want to know, what is the organization doing to capture those stories? How can people get access to them? And most importantly, how are those stories used? How are they integrated within the knowledge flow of an organization? So the second step that must be followed is the execution, or the implementation, I should say, of a narrative audit, to be able to understand how narratives, how stories are shared, and how they're integrated within the knowledge flow of an organization. Then the other point that is important within the processes that we want to follow to transform or to support the transformation of knowledge from tacit knowledge into critical knowledge is we need to do an audience analysis. And this may seem strange to some of us, but if we're talking about a narrative audit, if we're talking about using stories to capture critical knowledge so that we can if we're using tacit knowledge to impact critical knowledge, we need to understand who are the people that have those stories. We need to understand who are the people that listen to those stories. Who are the people that will use those stories? If we use storytelling to capture critical knowledge so that it can impact, let me rephrase. If we use storytelling to capture tacit knowledge so it can impact critical knowledge, we need to understand how audiences use the information that we capture in our stories. We need to understand what are the audience's interests, how they use that information, what their view is about how they work, what histories they bring to bear when they listen to the stories that we capture, what is their relationship with the critical knowledge that they used in the organization, what is their understanding of that critical knowledge. So it's very important to understand and to have an expansive view of what the audience is within an organization. That audience is obviously the community of members of the organization, or the communities, because any large organization will be made up of many different communities that represents many different types of corporate culture within the organization. So for us to be able to do this in a way that is strategic, we really have to understand who are the audiences that we are working with, because those audiences will be the ones that will use the information. And not only that, those audiences will be the ones that we will go to find storytellers whose tacit knowledge will be useful to impact critical knowledge throughout the organization. The other thing that I want to mention in terms of the processes that support knowledge transformation is that this is a process that needs to be carried out in a way that is deliberate, that is intentional, in a way that has that is part of a plan. We want to make sure that we have a purpose laid out as to why we're following these processes, what is our ultimate goal, and how many. And the other thing that is important in terms of using these processes is we want to make sure that we have enough buy-in within the organization, that we've brought enough people into the organization to, or that we've garnered enough support from the leadership and other stakeholders within the organization to support this kind of work. For example, a knowledge audit, as you all know, it is a process that requires us to move through different levels of the organization. The same for the narrative audit. Just the fact that you would want to complete a narrative audit in an organization would require you, for example, explaining what a narrative audit is, what are the benefits, why it is important to use. So that's why I'm saying that in order for these processes to work, there has to be a structure in place, a structure that speaks to the stakeholders, that gives a clear and consistent rationale, a process that can give a sense of what the possible outcomes are and how those outcomes will be used to move forward and impact other elements within our plan. So now that we have this clear and that we've discussed a little bit about these processes, I want to turn now to the central part of our discussion. We've talked about what is critical knowledge. We've talked about the difference between critical knowledge and tacit knowledge. We've also talked about how tacit knowledge can impact, can transform, can change, can enhance critical knowledge within an organization. And we've looked at some of the overall processes within an organization that we can use to transform those, critical knowledge. Now I want to move towards the central and most important part of the presentation, and that is the narrative strategies that we can use for knowledge transformation. As I said before, I've outlined some of the general processes that we can use to begin that transformation. But our conversation today is specifically about how do we use stories to aid that transformation of critical knowledge? How do we use stories to lay a bridge between tacit knowledge and critical knowledge? So I want to take a few minutes to talk about this point because it's really the center and the most important aspect of this conversation. So when we talk about the transformation of critical knowledge, because due to the impact of new information that comes as a result of tacit knowledge, I want us to think of a few things. The first one that you see on your screen, and I'm going to start from the left side and at the bottom. At my left side, I guess if you're watching it on your screen, it would be your right side. So I'm going to begin first with the call and response techniques. So there are many ways to name this process, but just for simple and quick understanding, I'm going to call it call and response techniques. So the call and response techniques refer to the points where when someone is telling a story in a live setting, whether it is live online or in a face-to-face setting, when somebody is telling a story that is related to a process or a project, how a project came into existence, or a story that illustrates how a particular procedure must be done, or a story that is about how a process failed, when the person is telling the story to a live audience, the audience is listening to the story, and the person who's telling that story has to be mindful of what the audience is, how the audience is responding. So when someone is telling this story, if they notice that the audience may appear confused, or may not be following the story, or may not be reacting the way that the storyteller is expecting, the storyteller then has to think, what are the things that are missing? What are the elements that are missing in the story that are not allowing the audience to respond the way it should? Or if the audience, on the other hand, is responding to a specific aspect of the story, maybe the story, maybe there is a specific task in the story that the audience is responding to more effusively, the storyteller has to figure out then, well, that part of that particular task elicited a stronger response, so maybe the storyteller will want to give more information, explain a little bit more about the background. So this is where we talk about tacit knowledge in storytelling. So the storyteller is watching the response of the audience and the reaction to different aspects of the story. Those aspects where there is some type of reaction from the audience can be ways in which the audience is signaling to the storyteller that they may want more information, more clarification, more enhancement, more additional details. So this call and response means that that tacit knowledge is the result of the audience interacting with the storyteller. When a storyteller tells a story, they enter into a kind of a dance with the audience, where they bring the story and the audience gives its attention, but not only gives its attention, but it also reacts, it also communicates with the storyteller in a way that is nonverbal and sometimes even verbal. There may be stories or there may be settings where the storyteller is telling a story and they may get a question from the audience that may be about a particular process that elicits additional tacit knowledge from the storyteller. So this is one of the first strategies to keep in mind when we're talking about how we can transform critical knowledge. The other aspect that I want to talk about is data storytelling. This is an issue that many organizations grapple with. Our organizations are awash in data. We use data for everything. We have data centers, we have data farms, we have data divisions. But one of the challenges that many organizations have is that a lot of the data that is generated and that is communicated and transferred and shared is not always data that it is not always within a framework that allows non-data users, let's put it like that, or non-data analysts, folks that are not data analysts, to immediately understand or use or find or see the impact of the data that is generated, or even find ways to use the data creatively. Create a narrative around data. When we create a framework that explains, for example, either how the data came into existence, or what were the steps to get that data to come into place, or how that data can be useful and impactful to their specific setting and their specific day-to-day work. When we introduce a narrative as an accompaniment to the data itself, that allows or creates opportunity for the sharing and the transformation of tacit knowledge into critical knowledge. One example to add to that is if we have a data analyst that is presenting data, that is presenting the findings of a data analysis. If the data scientist or data analyst is presenting this finding in the context of a story, then the analyst can then get into a place where it is more likely for them to give more context, broader context in terms of how the data was generated, as I said before, or how the data could be used. And if we think about data storytelling, for example, and a situation like the one we mentioned before, the call and response, if there is a narrative around the data analyst is presenting it in the form of a story, they can get into that call and response where they can give the audience a chance to ask questions, to talk a little bit more about the context of the data. So that context that we bring to the data, in many ways, is tacit knowledge, because it is the knowledge that the data scientist had in their mind in terms of when the data was either collected or when they thought about how the data could be used for a particular process. The other aspect in terms of how narratives can impact or transform knowledge are related to aspects that is about assessment and evaluation. So when we think about that, when we think about stories within an organization, one of the things that is important in terms of capturing tacit knowledge that could impact critical knowledge is we want to have in place either checklists or some form of assessment to decide what are the, how do we evaluate or assess that we have a good story? How do we evaluate or assess that the story is going to, that we're capturing critical knowledge, that we're capturing tacit knowledge that will impact critical knowledge? So what I want to bring forth in this point is that it's important to have mechanisms to judge the usefulness, the utility of the information that we're gathering. So we want to have some form of a checklist or some guide that will allow us to judge the value of the information that we are capturing, so we can use that to see if that information will impact the existing critical knowledge. So if we pursue this line, we want to come up with some kind of a guideline that can be used to say, yes, this information is this level of tacit knowledge that we've acquired and we've transformed and that we're going to use to impact critical knowledge is actually useful. So we want to have a set of parameters or guidelines that help us describe what it is that we're doing. And this goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning in terms of articulating what is critical knowledge, where it is, how we capture it. So having some form of evaluation or measurement that allows us to know that what we're doing is in fact what we want to do is an important strategy to impact the transformation of knowledge. And then we have two more as we move forward toward the end of this. The other thing that is important, and I mentioned this before, is we want to have a strategy that talks about how we integrate that knowledge that we captured into the workflow. For us to take tacit knowledge and have it transform or change or impact critical knowledge, we have to have a strategy that allows us to connect that tacit knowledge to the workflow, of the organization, to the day-to-day. How do we take those stories that we've captured, those perhaps personal stories of how a project came into existence, stories of how something, what lessons we learned, how we take that story and integrate it in the workflow is critical. It's essential for that story to be able to really impact critical knowledge. So what I want to bring to mind is that the mere capturing of a story, a personal story that has important levels of tacit knowledge is not enough. What is important is that once that is captured, that we find ways to integrate it within the workflow. That is where the true impact, the true change, the transformation, the connection, the enhancement will occur. It will only occur when we're able to integrate it within the workflow. So that is another strategy that we need to keep in mind, the integration of those narratives within the workflow, the connection of those stories to the day-to-day of our organization. That is why it is important to pay attention and understand the culture of the organization, the cultures, the communities, that audience that we are reaching out to. And then the final process is about, in terms of impacting critical knowledge in an organization with tacit knowledge. One, I have two basically bundled up in one. One is we want to offer some sort of a training or some sort of a instructional approach to how people are learn to share personal stories. We want to make sure that we are give people an opportunity to find ways to use their personal stories to share critical knowledge, to share tacit knowledge. So if an organization can develop a guide or have staff members that can guide others in terms of how to share a personal story related to a project, related to a process, in a way that that person is sharing critical information that they may have, that only they would have. If we have some form of a guidance or training or practical advice, that would take the organization, that would take us very far, because we have personal stories that may be filled with important tacit knowledge. It doesn't necessarily mean that we can automatically share it, or share it very well, or share it very efficiently. So it is important for an organization to then think about what it needs to do to be able to put in place either training resources or didactic resources that will help people to learn how to share those stories. And most importantly, to help knowledge management professionals find ways to take those stories and connect them to the organizational workflow. So training and education are very important elements within the strategies that we could use to transform, to aid knowledge transformation within our organizations. Now that we have gone through this process and that we've considered what are the strategies that we can use to impact critical knowledge in the organization, I want to just give you a little bit of a sense of how you can learn a little bit more about this. There's a lot of literature out there that talks about using narratives to impact knowledge sharing within an organization. I want to take an opportunity to tell you a little bit about what I have done, my work in this area. I have, last year I published a book on knowledge management and the practice of storytelling. And in that book, I talk about critical knowledge and about tacit knowledge. And one of the things that I mentioned, as you see here on the screen, is that when we talk about storytelling, when we talk about specifically personal experience, when we talk about that, we allow people, or when we give people an opportunity to talk about their personal experiences or write about those personal experiences, either in a blog or a wiki or any other form of, in any other way, we give people a chance to explore and explain the meaning and purpose of the actions and events in the narrative. So what this means is that when you're telling a personal story, especially if we go back to that call and response, you give people a chance to think about and reflect about their experience with that story. One of the things that I talk about in my company, StoryDNX, is that the experience is the story, and the story is the experience. When you go through a particular experience using a tool or learning how to use a tool, there is a story there. And when you tell the story, you're reflecting on that experience. So when you tell a story, when you take a minute to think about a personal story related to your experience with a process within the organization, as you're thinking about that story or you're telling that story, you're actually thinking about the actions and the events within that narrative. So if we think about the organization that we're in, the narratives that we can capture, those personal narratives, they will reflect things about the company that are not necessarily available explicitly to everybody. In other words, that are not necessarily available within the explicit knowledge that the organization has. That's why I want to really encourage organizations to use storytelling to use narratives as a way to unlock, discover, capture tacit knowledge that can be useful to enhance and to impact critical knowledge. I want to thank everybody for their attention and for the opportunity granted to me. If you want to learn a little bit more about my background, you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter, or you can visit my company website at StoryDNX.com. And if you want to reach directly to me, you can also send me an email. Again, I want to thank you all for the opportunity and for a chance to talk to you about how knowledge management can, how storytelling can impact how we share and how we capture and share both tacit knowledge and critical knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Johel. Thank you very much for your wonderful sharing about storytelling, which is actually a new perspective for our audience to learn more about the technology, and also this is a new concept about critical knowledge. It's very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we have the Q&A.大家如果有问题的话，现在可以提问，然后我们的嘉宾呢会回答大家的问题。大家有问题可以直接话筒讲，或者是把问题输在聊天框里。其他平台的朋友们可以把问题反馈给我们的同事，然后我们的同事呢会把问题给到我们的嘉宾。Yeah, here is a question from the audience. I put it in the chat box. The first question is, what is the relationship between explicit knowledge and critical knowledge?
Okay, that's a great question. And thank you to the person who posted that question. Can you hear me well?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, perfect. So explicit knowledge, as we know, is the knowledge that is recorded throughout the organization in manuals, in training documents, in procedures. Procedural knowledge, for example, is explicit knowledge. So our organizations might be have a lot of explicit knowledge, a lot of information may have been recorded, but the relationship between explicit knowledge and critical knowledge is that some of that knowledge that is explicit may be essential to the functions of the organization. So not all knowledge that is explicit knowledge is critical knowledge. For example, there may be explicit knowledge that is archived, that is used as a reference for something that for processes that we want to enhance or learn about a little bit more. But the knowledge that is critical, that is essential for functions to happen, for processes to occur, that critical knowledge is in many ways, it's also explicit knowledge because it might be codified, like I said, in procedures and guidelines, in books, in rules, in blogs that explain how a process occurs. So if we look at it this way, not all, most critical knowledge is explicit knowledge, but not all explicit knowledge is critical knowledge. And critical knowledge can be explicit knowledge, but some critical knowledge can also be occur, like I was saying in the presentation, at a tacit level. Because when people are working in processes and people develop experiences using tools and performing functions, they might come into new knowledge that can enhance already existing critical knowledge. But in general, all critical knowledge tends to be explicit knowledge. I hope that answers the question for the poster.
Yeah, thank you. 那首先第一个问题呢是，这位观众朋友问的是显性知识和关键知识之间的关系。那我们知道很多就是这个显性知识，它是我们就可以记录在各种公司的培训手册、各种公司的指南，可能说SOP 里面。那组织里面有 非常多的这样的知识是被记录下来的。那显性知识和关键知识的之间的关系呢，是在于有一些显性的知识，它是对职能部门非常重要的。那这种知识呢，一般就是关键知识，但不是所有的显性知识它都是关键知识。比如说有的我们就是放在比如说公司的某个档案里，它只是可能大家用来就是参考之用，它并没有说对公司部门的职能有重大的影响。那关键知识呢，它可以是显性知识，它也可以是也是可以被就是记录下来的，记录在公司的各种规章手册里、各种指南里、各种流程程序里面。总结来说呢，就是大多数的关键知识这都是显性知识，但不是所有的显性知识都是关键知识。那关键知识它既可以是显性知识，也可以是隐性知识。因为像隐性知识，我们讲座里也提到的，可能在就是组织的可能这个新的技术、新的流程里，然后突然产生的这个隐性知识，也可能是我们个人或者是组织大家通过经验而得出来的隐性知识，或者是在大家使用新的工具，在这个过程当中可能产生了一些隐性知识。这些隐性知识因为对职能、对公司的运营效率非常的重要，所以它就是这个关键知识。好，以上就是对这个问题的回答。Thank you very much. And there is a second question in the chat box from Jack.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I love that question, actually. The question is, what's the structure of storytelling? So to answer that question, I want to put it this way. When we think of storytelling, we think of stories. The structure of a story is very simple. The structure of a story is one where you have a beginning, which is sort of a background of a series of events or happenings. Then you have a middle and you have an end. That's the basic structure of a story. The beginning of the story, where you have an explanation of the conditions that put in place or put in motion a certain set of events. Then the middle of a story is usually that part where those events, that background that you explain, that background begins to unfold and you have a crisis, you have a problem. Usually stories are about something that happens. When I tell people, the simplest definition of storytelling is about something that happened. When you tell a story about something that happened to someone, someplace, somewhere. So the simplest structure of a story is you have that beginning where you have an explanation of the background or the background of the story, the middle of the story where there is a problem or a crisis, and the end of the story where that crisis comes to a solution, where you find a solution or a conclusion to the crisis or the problems. When you think of a story, you can think of stories that are about how something started, what you call foundational stories. You can talk about stories about the journey. For example, if you think in an organization, think about how a unit or how a company started. That's a foundational story. But you also have stories about the journey, how you completed a project. For example, if you think about here in the United States, NASA has a lot of stories that are about the journey, how they were able to, for example, build a space rocket that went to the moon or went to explore the solar system. Those are stories that are about the journey. You have stories that are about failure, which are translated in stories of lessons learned. So those stories, they all have that same structure. A beginning where you have an exposition of events, a middle where there is a crisis or there is something that occurs that needs a solution, and then the end where you achieve that solution or there is a conclusion to that process. And the second part of the question is, how do you teach people to tell a story? Well, that's a great question, because that's a lot of what you see in a lot of storytelling companies. To teach somebody to tell a story, there are many variables. All of us are able to tell a story, but when you're teaching somebody to tell a story, what you're trying to do is finding a way to get people to tell a story that is focused, that is centered on a particular goal. When you teach people how to tell a story, you think about not only teaching them what the structure of a story is, but for example, the plot. The plot is the argument of the story. Sometimes you have a story that has several subplots. So when you're telling a story, one of the things you want to teach people is how do you stick to the plot of the story? How do you not go off in different tangents? Another thing about when you're teaching people to tell a story, part of teaching people to tell a story is teaching people how to understand the audience, how to tell a story that will reach the audience. So those are some of the things that we think about in terms of how to teach people to tell a story. And finally, when you think of going back to the question, how to teach people to tell a story, it depends. Sometimes, like in my company, what we do is we work with people who may want one-on-one consultations because they might feel that they need a little bit more encouragement or a little bit more skills in terms of standing in front of an audience. But then there is another part of teaching people how to tell a story where we work with groups. So we talk about how do you use your personal stories to share knowledge within an organization? How do you work with groups to share collective stories or group stories? So the teaching of storytelling can vary depending on the need of the person, depending on what they want to do with the stories, and depending on the audience that they are working with. I hope that answers the question.
好，第二个问题呢是讲故事的结构是怎么样的？然后这位就是你又是如何就是教别人去讲一个故事？Johel博士的回答是呢，就是其实这个故事的结构啊，主要就像我们传统的，它有3个部分，有开始，它有中间，然后结尾。开始呢，就是我们展开一个故事，我们来讲它的背景，然后去解释一下可能相关的这个情形，可能相关的条件环境是怎样的。然后在故事的中间呢，一般会涉及到可能某个人他在某个地方他遇到了哪个问题，他可能陷入了什么样的危机，然后故事的结尾就是他就如何就针对这个问题和危机得到了一个答案，就是一个总结啊，就这样的3段式结构。那我们面向就是很多组织的时候呢，我们讲故事的具体关于怎么样故事的时候呢，我们是都有，比如说可能涉及到很多就是组织内部，比如说经历的各种可能旅程，它可能是一个流程，一个程序，也可能是一个项目的完成。比如说这个组织或者说这个部门是如何去完成一个项目的。那像在比如说美国宇航局 NASA， 它就有很多的这个项目，就是它的有我们的探月项目，有各种就是航天飞机的项目，也还有很多就是火箭发射的项目。那除了这些比如说类似项目的这样整个就是流程下来的一个旅程一个过程以外，我们还有就是各种组织或者团队经历了一些失败的故事。那这个故事呢也是可以就是我们用来讲述，然后帮助大家从中吸取经验教训。好，这边第3个问题是如何教别人去讲故事。其实讲故事的话，这个因为是很多因人而异的，因为不同的人他有不同的故事，然后对不同的组织他也有不同的经历。那具体我在教别人讲故事的时候呢，我会让他就是着重的去瞄准一下，就是你的目标，你要讲这个故事，你的目标是什么？那这个具体的就是讲述的内容呢，它主要比如说涉及到3个层面。首先第一个，这个故事的结构，就是教他你这个故事有开头、有中间、有结尾。那第2个就是你的故事里要有情节，这个情节里面也包含了很多的可能这种主情节，然后这些加起来，然后它组成了一个就是总的一个情节。第3个是你在讲故事的过程当中，你要能够去感受和理解你的听众，你要知道你的听众他可能就是想听什么样的故事，或者说什么样的故事能够对他带来影响，你是如何能够做到去触及你听众的这个内心。那像在我们公司，我们跟比如说有的人他因为来需要咨询服务，有的人是1对1的，我们面向个人的，那他在讲故事的时候，他需要的可能更多的是我们去给予他鼓励，然后去帮助他，可能教给他一些就是关于在演讲或者讲故事方面的一些技巧。那我们如果是面向可能团体组织跟他们一起合作的时候呢，我们更多的可能是教给他们去如何使用个人的故事，或者是说集体的故事， 然后通过讲述这样的故事，然后在组织内部形成知识分享的氛围。好 ，Thank you for your answer。好，其他观众还有问题吗？
Doctor, this is Michelle, and I have a question. And you shared that's how an organization to do the transformation for the critical knowledge. My question is, after finish the process, what will be the effective way to have the organization to inherit the critical knowledge they have already stored or obtained? Thanks.
Okay, yes, I get it. Thank you, Michelle, for your question. So yes, so you're asking, once the organization have captured that critical knowledge, what's the process for them to retain that critical knowledge? Is that what you're thinking about?
Not only retain, but more like to pass around, to pass to the next generation by generation.
Okay, yes, I get it. Thank you so much, Michelle. That's a really great question. So yes, one of the things that I was talking about is, I think to answer your question, the most effective process or the most effective way to pass that critical knowledge, to others within the organization is to find ways to integrate that knowledge within the day-to-day. So for example, if you capture tacit knowledge that is going to impact critical knowledge, one of the things that you want to do, one of the things that they talk about in information science and in knowledge management is that sort of just-in-time information. So sometimes there's critical knowledge that can be applied to the point of a particular point within a particular point when a process is occurring. For example, if somebody is working on a project and they have critical knowledge could be stored, for example, it could be stored in help documents, or it could be stored in sort of Q&As that could accompany how processes occur. Another way to sort of pass that information on, that is in lessons learned. Lessons learned is one of the most effective ways, because when you do lessons learned and you capture them in whichever format you capture them, whether it is on video or you capture them in audio or in written format, the lessons learned are related to specific moments in time when a specific action occurred, and the lesson is about what came out of that. So when you think of lessons learned, in many cases, the lessons are about and not always, but in many cases, the lessons are about critical knowledge that came out of a particular experience that was not available before. So when that is captured in whatever format, some organizations have a database of lessons learned or a library of lessons learned that are organized by topics related to particular experiences or domains or processes. When those are organized that way and are made available, that is one way that we think about how the organization can pass that knowledge on. So I think your question has a lot to do with is that area of knowledge management that is critical, which is about how do we store, organize and store that knowledge. The knowledge has to be organized in a way that people can find it. Like I said, one example could be lessons learned, and of course there are other examples that like I mentioned before, like job aids and guides and or for example standard operating procedures, or they call SOPs. But however these are organized, which is very important, what is important is also that they are organized in a way that people can find them, and that they're organized in a way that is connected to folks' day-to-day experiences. That's why when we think about, for example, if we think of a manufacturing company, we want to make sure that, for example, standard operating procedures are available when those procedures are being carried out. That's one way that we connect that critical knowledge to the day-to-day. So if we have that information organized in standard operating procedures, for example, then we are able to pass them on to others. So that's one way that we can do it. I wish that I had more time to sort of get in a little bit deeper in how, in how, other ways that we can do this. But the basic, just the basic answer to your question is that when we capture the knowledge in ways like lessons learned, in forms like lessons learned or standard operating procedures, and then we organize them in ways that people can find them, that's one way that we can make sure that that knowledge is transferred to other people and is passed on to other people. I hope that answers your question. And thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I have a following up question. I'm sensitive about time, and that's the same thing. How this part in fact innovation. So that's the part around you document everything and everybody follow, and because we are the manufacturing industry, and
yes,
we are big company global wise, and a lot of as different locations find the different practices, and maybe centralize something will be different. Thank you.
Yeah. One last point, Michelle, you asked a really, really good question, and it's about innovation as well. That, for example, I mentioned standard operating procedures and I mentioned lessons learned, but another way that this can impact innovation is that the stories that you captured can also be organized as stories that can be used as a way to, for example, one of the things that I work in is design thinking. So in the design thinking process, there are many opportunities for storytelling. So if you think about design thinking as a process that helps you think through problems, think through new ways to perform if you think about new ways to perform existing actions or existing tasks or procedures, when you go through that design thinking process, where you kind of take a look at the actors in an organization, of the things that they do, each of those processes are processes where there are processes where you are able to go through where you can use stories to stories to talk about how either processes are changing, or like I said, use stories to rethink all processes, use stories to understand what the problem is. One of the big problems in innovation is about what is it that we're actually doing? What is it that we're innovating? What is the problem that we're trying to figure out? So storytelling is a way, especially, that helps you to kind of figure out. Sometimes the tacit knowledge is a way that storytelling can allow us to help our group or the people that we're working with to figure out what the problem is. So storytelling is a way, specifically when we talk about tacit knowledge and critical knowledge, that can definitely impact innovation. So thank you, Michelle. That's a really great point.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor.
好，那这个问题呢是说，就是组织它在比如说经历过某个项目或者说某个流程以后，那它如何去把能在这个过程当中获取的这个关键知识，能够把它就在公司里传递，可能传递给我们的新员工，这样传递给就是下一代的员工。那敦厚博士的回答是，就是我们可以就是最有效的就是把这个关键知识进行传递的方法，是我们把这些就是关键知识呢要融入到我们就是组织里日常的这个工作当中。因为像我们很多的主要比如说有两点，首先有3点。那首先第一点是我们在比如说经历一个项目或者是说经历一个流程以后，我们在这个过程当中，我们是得到了这个关键知识，我们把它储存以文件的形式存在下来，我们可能以比如说 Q&A 的问答的形式能把它留存下来，那这样呢可以是保存下来供就其他的员工去使用。那第二个方法呢，就是说是把它这个关键知识就把它看作是就是我们习得的一些经验教训，因为在 很多情况下，就是我们从经验教训当中获得的这个关键知识呢，是我们之前没有的。我们可以通过比如说视频、音频或者是书面的形式，把那一课，就是那个经验教训那一课把它记录下来，然后以及采取的相应行动也把它记录下来。那这样的具体呢，我们可以把它比如说归档到数据库当中，可能归档到或者是其他的一些就是档案库里，然后供就是组织内部这样持续的将这个关键知识进行传递。那就在这个话题上呢，要强调一点是，我们必须要确保就是这样的关键知识一定要能够让组织里的其他人能够去很容易的去找到。那这样呢，就形成了就是比如说第三种方法，就是我们在组织内我们常用的，比如说形成这个 SOP， 我们形成相应的这个指导方针。那这个呢是用来就是指导我们日常的工作的，比如说像在制造业我们公司我们常用的这个 SOP， 就特别是我们在完成一项项目或者是完成某个流程以后，我们得到了这个关键知识，我们通过这个 SOP 的形式把这个知识进行持续的传递。那就像刚才提到的，就是不管你通过何种方式将这个知识在组织内传递的时候，一定要确保这个知识它是能够让相关的人一定能够去容易去获取的，容易去使用的。这个问题呢，然后刚才又衍生了一点，就是我们如何去通过就是怎样的方式去影响到组织内部的创新。因为刚刚我们强调的像 SOP 经验教训，可能在组织里我们也有在使用。那这里我们可以通过就是我们讲的这个讲故事的方法，然后去帮助就是我们在组织里将这个隐性知识，然后以及这个关键知识都可以就是传递下去。那像这个里呢，就是像设计思维一样，就是我们可以通过就是拥有这种思维，然后让我们通过就是各种问题来思考。因为像比如说讲故事的话，我们可以也是从中就是可以发现很多，比如说发现很多的问题，可以让我们去思考，我们如何让这个流程然后进行一个转变，我们如何通过这个问题，通过去解决这个问题，然后得出一些创新的思路，然后呢，再以一种创新思路，然后最后呢，我们完成这个组织内部这个知识的分享。Thank you very much. I think and considering the time, and think that's all for today's webinar.
Thank you.
Dr. Johel, thank you very much again for your wonderful sharing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your time early in the morning.
No problem.
Thank you.
I see.
And let me share my screen. I need to get the feedback from the audience. Thank you for your time to attend our webinar. 非常感谢大家今天参与我们的讲座，然后我们也真诚的希望得到大家的反馈。那如果大家有任何反馈意见的话，可以扫下方的这个2维码，然后去填写里面的一些相关的问题。那这样呢，也能帮助我们做得更好。这里我们也做一下这个下期的预告。我们下期的这个组织隐性技能管理讲座是在3月29日。那天的演讲嘉宾呢是来自英国的 Dave Snowden 教授，他是 IBM 知识管理研究院以前的院长，是 Cyfin 管理决策框架的创始人，同时也是 Cyfin Code 这家公司的创始人兼首席执行官。他也是威尔士大学应用复杂性中心的创始人。他给我们带来的话题是如何通过讲故事和非正式渠道去编制和管理隐性知识流程。感兴趣的朋友可以扫右方的2维码，然后报名参与我们的这次讲座。那在今天讲座最后呢，我们跟大家分享一个消息，是我们在今年的9月3号到5号 我们即将在瑞士达沃斯举办第2届组织隐形技能管理论坛，感兴趣的朋友可以点击右下方我们的官方网址 www.GO-TKM.org， 然后了解更多的信息，也可以去关注我们的动态。好，今天的讲座就到这里，非常感谢大家的参与，我们下次再见。